Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. And today in history, January 17th, 1706, I believe it was, Benjamin Franklin was born. He was so famous in so many fields around the world that they actually called him the first American. We've probably all heard plenty of witty or pithy quotes and phrases that are attributed to him or that he made famous, like no pain, no gain, time is money, haste makes way, so many of them that are still with us today. But he was much more than just a creative and witty writer. So on this episode, I'm going to share with you what I see as my top, I don't even know what the number is, maybe 10 or so, my top favorite quotes from him on power, government, liberty, and more. And I'd like to do something like this like once a year or so with Franklin because he wrote so much, and maybe I'll start doing this with some other leading founders as well if you like this stuff. But every one I try to do a little bit different than the previous one and give it a little different perspective as well. But let's get right to it. Franklin on empires, the danger of empires. Here he is in a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette in May of 1781. He pointed out that empires, by pride and folly and extravagance, ruin themselves like individuals. He was a student of history. Of course, he was self-taught. I believe he only had 2 years of formal education when he actually he was born in Boston. When he finally made it to Philadelphia, he had $1 and then 20 pence copper in his pocket, and that's it. He's a self-made guy. This is a self-reliant, self-educated, this is a kind of really the American story, and that's why so many people, I think, like Benjamin Franklin, including myself. But empires, by pride and folly and extravagance, ruin themselves like individuals. And when you read about Benjamin Franklin, or you hear people talk about him, they often note that he actually really liked the British Empire. But they always kind of leave out a caveat, because Franklin was okay with it, not just if they didn't tax without representation, but there had to be a certain structure, almost a precursor in the view of the American people of what a republic or federal system should look like. And here he is in 1769 discussing the nature and cause of the disputes between the colonies and Great Britain. And he put it this way: supreme power and authority must not, cannot reside equally everywhere throughout an empire. So any large organization, government-wise, you can't have uniformity of laws, rules, regulations, and power and control over the entire thing. You had to have subsidiary levels. You had to have different areas handling different things. And he described it again in another one, observations on passage. So he would write observations on other people's pamphlets. And this one talking about the constitutional means to putting an end to these disputes. And he pointed out that the British state is only the island of Great Britain. The British legislature are undoubtedly the only proper judges of what concerns the welfare of that state. But the Irish legislature are the proper judges of what concerns the Irish state, and the American legislature of what concerns the American states, respectively. A little precursor to the 10th Amendment as well. So in other words, you have to have a somewhat decentralized system. Of course, he liked consolidated power more than many others, but he also recognized that it had to have some limits. And these are very early writings, if you're talking about 1769, about kind of a federal type structure, a decentralized structure where each layer took care of its own thing. Patrick Henry had a similar take in 1765 as well. And of course, one of the ways that he warned that this type of thing might happen here in the United States as well, he certainly did warn that as well, was through executive power. He did not like a single person having so much power. And of course, they fought a long, bloody war against a hereditary monarch, the king and parliament, basically unlimited power. It was the Declaratory Act where they would claim the power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And so he was concerned about the executive branch being proposed at the Philadelphia Convention. I don't think he was ever convinced to like the form that it took. And here's how he put it on June 4th, 1787. He said, "The executive will be always increasing here, as elsewhere, till it ends in a monarchy. So Benjamin Franklin warned us that we would have a relentlessly increasing set of powers in the hands of a single person until it ended in a monarchy. And now we don't have a hereditary monarch here today, but in many ways, executives, presidents of today wield far more power than monarchs of Benjamin Franklin's time. So I would say in many ways, he certainly called it with that prediction. And of course, to me, my favorite prediction from the Philadelphia Convention. This is the day that we call Constitution Day. I've cited this many times. September 17, 1787. This is the closing of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He rises to make a speech. Well, he wrote it out, and I believe James Wilson read it for him. He was pretty old at this point. But he said, hey, let's ratify this. I agree to it. You guys all know I have problems with it. He says, but, this is as good as we're going to get with all these different viewpoints. He said, there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. So if you have good people in office doing the right thing, you're going to get good results. But he didn't expect that to last for long. Of course, everyone knew who the first president was going to be, George Washington, and whether you love him or hate him, everyone was pretty much on board with this has got to be the guy. He said, and I believe farther that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. So Benjamin Franklin certainly recognized that no matter how good you could get the words on paper to read, that as long as the people were corrupt and the people wanted despotism, that's what you'd end up with. You can't rely on words on paper to limit the power of tyrants. You can put some rules down, and if good people are there, they're going to follow them. And if the people themselves are good, they're not going to tolerate anything that goes beyond that. And that's probably where the notion of a republic, madam, if you can keep it, comes from. Because ultimately, they created a republic. And it's not a republic if the people in power can keep it a republic, but if the people of the several states themselves can do that. I covered that, and I've done a bunch of episodes on Franklin over the last few years. But a republic, if you can keep it, will be linked to in the show notes discussing this end of the Philadelphia Convention, these predictions from Benjamin Franklin, and the warning that it is up to the people themselves to protect and preserve their own constitution and their own liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. And certainly they do not. And here he is a couple of years later in 1789. And this is, of course, now things are in effect. The Constitution is in effect. He's writing a letter to his old friend Jean-Baptiste Leroy. He hadn't heard from him a while. I think he was a little concerned about what was going on in France and if he was okay. But he pointed out, and this is, of course, a very timeless quote from Benjamin Franklin, our new Constitution is now established and has an appearance that promises permanency. But in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. We've all heard that phrase. Unfortunately, Benjamin Franklin passed away just months later, so that was a pretty timely one as well. So nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. And speaking of taxes, Benjamin Franklin, of course, he was warning about pride and extravagance and folly and empires growing and collapsing, but he also recognized that, taxation was one of the tools that they would use to expand their power and then, of course, lead to this inevitable despotism and collapse and rinse and repeat. He says, as all history informs us, this is again at the Philadelphia Convention, June 2nd, 1787, as all history informs us, there has been in every state and kingdom a constant kind of warfare between the governing and the governed. Again, a student of history, he recognized, of course, Benjamin Franklin, despite all of his success, he was a self-made man. And I think he was kind of a champion, especially amongst a lot of the more aristocratic type Federalists. He was certainly a Federalist. But he was more of a champion of the average person in many ways. And this is, I think, a recognition that people with power were always basically, this is just something we've seen all through history. The existence of government has proven this, if you're being honest. But he recognized that in all history, every country, all the time, everywhere, there was always some kind of a warfare, even if it wasn't outright, between the people, the rulers, and the governed themselves. And he goes on and he says, generally, indeed, the ruling power carries its point. He recognized, of course, John Adams did as well, talking about the American Revolution, the war for independence. This was a rare situation to see, as Adams put it, 13 clocks striking as one. That's not something that happens too often. In most convulsions like that, you actually end up getting, a more powerful central government, a Mao or something like that. But Franklin points out that generally it's the people with power, they win. They carry the point. The revenues of princes constantly increasing, and we see that they are never satisfied, but always in want of more. They always want more power. They always want more money, and they do this. Of course, it was only through taxation. We have a different form of that we have today that I'll get to in just a moment that Franklin talked about as well. But they're always trying to take more from the people to enrich themselves, to expand their power and control. This is really a description of a sociopath, not Benjamin Franklin, but of the people with power. You can't just have the power and follow the rules and do the right thing. You're always trying to scam people and use violence and threats of violence in order to enrich yourselves and your friends and your supporters. I mean, this is a pretty early description of a psychopath or a sociopath, but that's a side note. Franklin continued, the more the people are discontented with the oppression of taxes, the greater need the prince has of money to distribute among his partisans and pay the troops that are to suppress all resistance and enable him to plunder at pleasure. I mean, this is also a precursor to the very popular in some circles view that taxation is theft. He's talking about how, well, of course, for Franklin, he didn't think that all taxation would have been theft or plunder, but certainly once you go beyond a very limited set of powers that government is authorized, have everything after that is just pure plunder. It's robbery. And he also recognized that they would use forms of welfare, basically redistribution of wealth, taking money from here, handing it to others, getting people dependent on the system. It sounds very familiar to what we live under today. Again, that was June 2nd, 1787. And one of the ways, as I mentioned, that they do taxation isn't as much because so many people are kind of tax exempt. I mean, even though there's a lot of hidden taxes in almost everything that we do, just because someone doesn't pay an income tax doesn't mean that they're not impacted by so many other taxes, federal, state, and local. I mean, even just, the sales tax and the taxation that goes through regulation makes things more expensive. So this all comes out of people's pockets. So instead of being able to keep the what they earn, so much of it ends up going to government, and they control people that way. But one of the worst ways, and maybe the most insidious tax we have today, as Ron Paul would describe it, is the inflation tax. Now, inflation isn't, if we're defining it properly, and as Benjamin Franklin here, I'll get to in a moment, in 1779 pointed out, inflation isn't just a bunch of greedy businesses raising prices to rip people off. Inflation is really a depreciation in the value of the purchasing power of money that drives prices up. I mean, all things being equal, prices will go up if you print too much money. If you have paper currency and they just can, or any type of fiat money that has no limits that government can create out of thin air, then that is going to devalue its purchasing power, and everything that everyone buys will cost more. And he noted this in 1779. This was a big issue here. And at one point, the British actually even counterfeited notes to actually cause economic strife in the colonies during the conflict as well. But he said the depreciation of the American paper is solely owing to the excessive quantities. The only reason that people were losing purchasing power was because there was an excessive amount of printing of money. That's Benjamin Franklin to Dumas in 1779. And then the following year, of the paper money of America in 1780, he wrote about the effect and the impact of this depreciation, what so many people call inflation, price inflation today. He said, the general effect of the depreciation among the inhabitants of the states has been this, that it has operated as a gradual tax upon them. So well before Ron Paul or Peter Schiff or any modern Austrian economic expert talked about inflation being a tax on the people, Benjamin Franklin was referring to the inflation tax as a tax on money all the way back in 1780. He said, their business has been done and paid for by the paper money, and every man has paid his share of this tax according to the time he retained any of the money in his hands. Inflation discourages savings. It encourages you to spend now, because if you know that the price of something that is $100 today will be $150 in a while in the future, you're likely to spend it. Because if you hold on to it longer, you've lost 50% of your purchasing power. So the longer you actually hold money, what you actually need to build prosperity, which is savings, the longer that you actually do the right thing, government is stealing that purchasing power from you. He said, their business has been done and paid for by the paper money, and every man has paid his share of this tax according to the time he retained any of the money in his hands, and to the depreciation within that time. Thus, it has proved a tax on money. Now, I'm going to have all this stuff linked to in the show notes, all these original source documents, plus the other episode, maybe a couple of other articles as well. I've got an article that I prepped based on these top quotes and what I'm discussing here today that'll be published over at the homepage at 10thamendmentcenter.com sometime later today as well. Alan Mosley will get the blog post for the podcast all set up, and I'll publish it in a couple of hours after this live stream is done here today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while I'm here, I just want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. Whether you're watching live or watching or listening in the archive, whatever platform you're on, whether it's one of the mainstream ones we stream on, YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn and X, Twitch, and etc. We also stream at rumble.com and odyssey.com. We have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place. So wherever you happen to watch or listen, I really appreciate you. If you want to leave a review on any of the platforms, Apple Podcasts, for example, that certainly helps us spread the word and reach more people. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining us here in the live chat. There's Cheriton Farmer, Kirk Morrison. Hope you're both doing well. Melody, Imperial Guard, Grant, Sonny Bono, Lawrence Smith, Haji, Upbeat, Sparrow, President Merkin Muffley, good to see you as well. Kathy Cooper and everyone else. There's Grand Level and a few others. I know I'm skipping a few. Bishop, I appreciate you being here. I'll read through the chat a little bit later today or later in the episode if I have a few minutes. I get tons of ideas for future episodes from your comments, your feedback. Sometimes you're challenging me, things like that. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Anyways, let's get back to it. So Franklin talking about taxation and power and consolidation and federalism, but he also recognized that tyrants are going to do tyrant stuff, and you got to do something to deal with it, especially if we take into consideration his warning at the end of the Philadelphia Convention that it was going to end in despotism because the people actually have become so corrupt. And you'd only get a republic if the people themselves can keep the republic. And then also recognizing that people with power would always expand their power. This is a really kind of very interesting mix because ultimately it gets down to the people themselves doing something about it, doing the right thing. And here's a letter to Jane Meacom in November of 1773. He said, "In my own private concerns with mankind, I have observed that to kick a little one under imposition has a good effect. A little sturdiness when superiors are much in the wrong sometimes occasions consideration. And there is truth in the old Italian saying, it's an old Italian proverb from the late 16th century. He said that if you make yourself a sheep, the wolves will eat you." There's a lot of sheep. We are literally surrounded by sheep, and the wolves have been feasting for generations, especially when it comes to usurpations of power and violations of the Constitution, violations or attacks on your liberty. Make yourselves a sheep, and the wolves will eat you. Here he is with another one. Of course, what do you do to deal with people in power? He proposed this I think it was just hours after the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Of course, he was on the Committee of Five. He primarily played the role of editor to Thomas Jefferson. Some small changes were made based on his recommendation for the Declaration of Independence. But of course, his name lent significant amount of weight to that as well. But shortly after they approved it, the same day, a committee was also appointed to come up with a great seal for the United States. And Benjamin Franklin was on that as well, and he recommended this one. He did not originate the phrase. I'll have a link in the show notes from the great historian J.L. Bell that tells this full history of this phrase, but this was what he recommended as the Great Seal of the United States. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And here he is again in a letter to James Bowdoin in 1775. If we tamely give up our rights in this contest, a century to come will not restore us in the opinion of the world. If you take a stand for your liberty and you just blow it, or if you talk about it and you don't do anything, if you tamely give up your rights, you just let it roll, you are kind of a disgrace to humanity, is what he's saying. If we tamely give up our rights in this contest, a century to come will not restore us in the opinion of the world, said Benjamin Franklin. We shall be stamped with the character of dastards and poltroons and fools, and be despised and trampled upon, not by this haughty, insolent nation only, but by all mankind. Present inconveniences are therefore to be borne with fortitude and better times expected. It's February 25th, 1775 that he wrote that. Mind you, this is a year plus before the Declaration of Independence. He had also, in 1775, more than a year before the Declaration of Independence, actually submitted the first proposal for an Articles of Confederation. It was tabled. They didn't consider it. But he was really, really pushing for this type of federation of the colonies or the states all the way back to 1754 when he helped co-author the Albany Plan. This was really the first formal proposal, also rejected, for a federation of the colonies. So he recognized that, oh man, here in this phrase, he's saying, look, we got to take a stand. It may be difficult. The odds may be against us. Present inconveniences are therefore to be borne with fortitude. The following year, in December of 1776, of course, we get the much more famous quote from Thomas Paine in The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. Summer soldier. Of course, he's talking about as well, you have to push on, said Thomas Paine. And there's a very similar approach, far less radical, we'd think, of Benjamin Franklin, but certainly taking the same type of mentality as well. I've got a few here from Poor Richard's Almanac. This was here from the overview at Wiki. Poor Richard's Almanac, sometimes called Almanac, or spelled Almanac without a K, was a yearly almanac published by Benjamin Franklin, who adopted the pseudonym of Poor Richard. He did that for a series of years, and then he replaced it with Poor Richard Improve, or Richard Saunders, for this purpose. The publication appeared continually from 1732 to 1758. So 26 years he published this. It was very popular. It made him a lot of money. He had a lot of great witty quotes that were very timely. Some people have described him as kind of the American capitalist, the description of the American capitalist of the time. So they say it sold exceptionally well for a pamphlet published in the 13 colonies. Print runs reached around 10,000 per year. So he made quite a bit of money off of that, made some fame. And I want to highlight a few of these that I think are just pretty awesome, that are timeless, that are not the haste make waste, the more popular ones of today. And he points out here from 1733 that distrust and caution are the parents of security. So if you want to be safe, if you want to be free, then, well, because you really can only be safe if you're free. Those who give up essential liberty for a little temporary safety deserve neither, is a more famous quote. But he's also recognizing that you distrust the people who may harm you. You are very cautious about the people or situations that may harm you. And if you want to be secure, you have to start out with that mentality. In 1738, he said, "Sell not virtue to purchase wealth, nor liberty to purchase power." In 1755, this one is pretty awesome to me. "Who is wise? He that learns from everyone. Who is powerful? He that governs his passions. Who is rich? He that is content. And who is that? Nobody." So this is a goal to try to reach to. So learning from every single person, keeping our passions a little bit in check. We're content with our life as we have it. We're grateful for what we have. We see the silver lining, but it's probably very few people who reach that goal throughout their life. I know that is all a goal for me, certainly. And of course, I hear all the time, hey, good job on this, great writing, great reporting, great coverage, things like that. But this one really, really strikes me as very important, something that I'm going to carry with me now that I've reread it once again. Well done is better than well said. Actions speak louder than words. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational more than anything. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. If you want to help us get these kinds of messages out to more and more people, reach and teach more people on these founding principles about the Constitution, about liberty, about how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is constantly 24/7, 365. Absolutely nothing helps us do this work more every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty, depreciated government fiat, throw it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I don't think anyone punches above their weight class better than the TAC. We have annual, lifetime, 5-year, monthly options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, all spelled out. I'd appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. No pressure, but it certainly would help us out. Let me take a look over in the chat here for a minute or so. There's some discussion about fiat money and the seal. I'll have to take a look a little bit closer on that. We need to fight fiat money, says Kirk Morrison. Absolutely. It's essential, of course, because as long as you use the tools that the government uses as a tool to control you, you shouldn't be surprised that government power keeps growing and growing and growing. That's why we spend so much time in our nullification work and in our education work, which is they're both very, very much overlapped, encouraging people and teaching people how to reject, resist, and undermine and eventually nullify the central bank into oblivion where it's belonged since day one and where its precursors always belonged. As Thomas Jefferson told us, to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to give them a boundless field of power, and I think that's a great example of what we have with the Federal Reserve today. Taking a look a little bit more. Haji says Franklin was not only a political philosopher, a great diplomat, of course, he helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris as well, but an early version of a life coach, especially if you read Poor Richard's Almanac. There's so many day-to-day life lessons on how to just make yourself, your life, your goals and things like that a little bit better. I'm not sure if I'm describing it well, but I'll put some links in the show notes so you can read, the links for all these 17, 33, 38, 55, 37, they'll all be there, and you'll be able to find the entire series and read through them. They're all very short sentences and really witty. Anyways, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you're having an awesome day so far. I hope you're staying safe, warm, healthy, and the like, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.